Good morning to all of you, and I hope you're having a wonderful Sunday and a blessed weekend. The topic for my presentation this morning is William Wilberforce. Although not found as an ordained person, he was not in charge of a congregation, never worked for the established church. William Wilberforce is found in the book of Holy Women and Holy Men, and also in a commentary on the saints by Sam Portero called Brightest and Best. He's a former chaplain at the University of Chicago and also at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and also served as a parish priest in North Carolina. Both books contributed to my research, along with the book Amazing Grace by Eric Metajas. This book captures the essence of a spiritual strength, a moral clarity, and human frailty also, and divine purpose that dwelled among men and women at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century in England. This presentation deals with two things: his commitment to fight for the abolition of slavery, not only in England, but in other countries in Europe, and also his commitment to take that into the New World. The single most institutional memorial to Wilberforce that could ever be is the university that bears his name. 154 years ago, men and women came together across racial lines, classes, and economic status to create America's first private, historically black college and university located in the town of Wilberforce, Ohio. Born on August 24, 1759, into a prosperous merchant family in the city of Hull in England, his family was able to be traced to the 12th century in Yorkshire and the reign of Henry II. The family's original last name was Wilberforce, but the patriarch of the family did not like that, and he changed it, and two reasons were given for it. One, he seemed to be the kind of person that would change things that he did not like. He was very forceful. And then also the suffix "foss" meant vassal or servant in Irish. The port of Hull would become an important trading spot, with American tobacco, Norwegian timber, and Prussian iron being unloaded and local exports loaded and shipped down the Hull River. Later, it would become an important whaling port. Though Hull was the fourth largest port in England at that time, it was the only one that did not participate in the slave trade. Though the Wilberforce family had been merchants in the area for 2 centuries, it wasn't until the 18th century that the family benefited from the trade in the Baltic Sea and inherited land and property. By all accounts, William was a glorious little child. He was called a cherub of twinkling luminosity. An unusual thoughtfulness for others marked his youngest childhood. According to all who knew him in those early days, he was possessed of a temper eminently affectionate. As a child, though, he was sickly and with severe myopia. Despite these physical challenges, he seemed to captivate all who knew him. In 1766, when enrolled in school at the age of 7, he was tiny then, and for the rest of his life, he was also very small. He never grew taller than 5'3", with a very slight frame that at times only packed 76 pounds. Even at that age, his teacher described William this way: "His elocution was so remarkable that we used to set him up on a table and make him read out loud as an example to the other boys." Early in his life, tragedy befell the family by the death of the eldest sister. Then his father, a few months later, died suddenly at the age of 40. And a few months after that, his mother fell ill with high fever and cough. And it was decided that Billy, as he was called at that time, would go and live with his aunt and uncle in Wimbledon. This move to Wimbledon brought about a new school for Billy, one that he despised. Putney School was led by a Scottish master with a very disagreeable assistant. The food was described as nauseous, and the education lacked the brilliance of Hull Grammar School. His new home, though, was a place that Billy liked a lot. Soon he came to love his aunt and uncle, whom he visited on holidays. Without children of their own, Wilberforce became their heir. Besides being very wealthy, with several residences, they provided Billy with something he had never experienced before. The greatest influence they had on him was spiritual. Hull, being a port town, was a gay card-playing parties and theater. Little or no introspection, nothing more than worldly amusements. One's spirituality was confined to one's rented pew on Sunday mornings. At Wimbledon, Wilberforce experienced for the first time something far more satisfying than the thin gruel and weak tea of high church Anglicanism. His aunt and uncle were at the epicenter of a spiritual renaissance in England. Being close friends with George Whitefield, the human engine behind the Great Awakening, and with John Newton, the former slave ship captain that penned the hymn Amazing Grace, Whitefield was instrumental in Billy's aunt's and half-brother John Thornton's conversion, whereby he became known for his generosity in funding many efforts to help the poor and suffering as he shared his immense wealth. Whitefield, Charles, and John Wesley arrived in Oxford University in the 1730s, giving way to a new spiritual movement known for their fervent and conspicuously praying. Found by others to be too methodical, they were dubbed Methodists. Whitefield made his last trip to the colonies in 1769, the same year that Billy went to live with his aunt and uncle, and very surely they never met. But Whitefield's influence was passed on through to Billy by his family. Another figure that Billy met and got to know was John Newton, the man that introduced young Wilberforce to the evils of slavery and the slave trade. After many visits, the sea captain and young William forged a strong bond. Wilberforce said that he revered Newton as a parent when I was a child. Newton would visit the Wilberforces in London for what Newton called parlor preaching. Wilberforce, sympathizing with the Methodists and their spiritual practices, was met with very strong opposition by his grandfather, who said the following: "If Billy turns Methodist, he shall never have a sixpence of mine." But at that time, Billy was attending church and chapel with family and friends that surrounded him with the love, and he became very interested in the subject of religion. Soon his mother came to rescue Billy and take him back to Hull. Now, back at Hull and attending the school at Pocklington, Billy resolved to cling to his faith. His mother, Elizabeth, kept Billy from going to church, to any church. And this he writes in a letter to his aunt. In a letter to his Aunt Hannah, Wilberforce wrote that one of his greatest misfortunes during that time was not being able to hear the blessed word of God, as my mama would not let me go to high church on a Sunday afternoon. But the Lord was every day granting me some petition, and I trust I can say that I increased in the knowledge of God and Christ Jesus, whom he sent, whom to know is life eternal. By 1775, now 16, he had become vain and full of fun. No longer serious, his manners and social graces had been buffed to a high sheen. He goes to Cambridge in 1776. The next 4 years were full of parties and gatherings where Wilberforce fed and entertained many friends, many sorts of people, not only the rich, but also those who did not have much of anything. And he writes, "By every account, Wilberforce seems to have been extraordinarily charming. From earliest childhood to the end of his life, he captivated others with his mind and with his singular voice. He was brilliantly witty, effervescent, and brightly cheerful, not to mention generous. He had a supreme gift for hospitality that would go a long way towards helping him in his political career in years hence. But at Cambridge, it manifested itself less grandly and to no particular purpose. He threw dinners in his rooms for all and sundry. The deaths of his grandfather and in 1777 of his dear Uncle William had made Wilberforce a very wealthy young man indeed. Although not a drunkard, Wilberforce was not studious. He felt that some of his friends kept him idle. Studying was for saps. The upper classes at that time invested their time in entertainment and parties. In 1779 to 1780, he spent more time in London with his friend William Pitt, who later would become Prime Minister of England. Wilberforce acquired his taste for politics during this time. A desire to engage in the debate on the floor of Parliament grew inside of him. During the spring of 1780, the idea to run for election to the House of Commons finally lodged in his mind. If elected, he would be 21 years old and serving in Parliament. On December 11th, 1780, Wilberforce was elected by a large margin of votes. During his first years in London, he returned to the life of dancing, drinking, and singing. Greatly renowned for his singing voice, Wilberforce became known as the Nightingale of Commons. During a trip to France, Wilberforce met Benjamin Franklin, a brilliantly witty 24-year-old meeting with a brilliantly witty 77-year-old. Two great champions of abolition before either had put their names to the list of pro-abolition. In 1787, Wilberforce would begin his 50-year battle against slave trade, pro-abolition, and ultimate emancipation. What Wilberforce calls the Great Change takes place in his life, not necessarily abruptly, but slowly and steadily. He took a powerfully dim view of anything touching Methodism, the Methodism of his aunt and uncle. He thought one could be good and moral without overdoing things. The old doctrines of Christianity and the Bible had served their purposes in their day, but the idea of believing in them and preaching them in the 18th century seemed willfully silly. During a buggy ride throughout France, Wilberforce and his friend Isaac Milner discussed many aspects of religion and theology. As sparring friends, neither dealt with issues in a deep way. On February 5th, 1785, Wilberforce picked up a book titled The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, written in 1740 by Philip Doddridge. After arriving in London, a seed had been planted in Wilberforce's soul that would grow and bloom beyond all possibility of concealing. The gay, carefree fellow of just a few months before now is concerned with the waste by the rich and the want of the poor. On a subsequent trip with Milner again, the accompanying book is a Greek New Testament. Wilberforce pressed upon his friend his doubts, objections, and difficulties. And one by one, Milner expounded his answers. Wilberforce did not see hypocrisies as something accepted, as it was accepted as a tenet of English society. Honesty was of utmost importance. Let me read to you another quote from Wilberforce. I got a clear idea of the doctrines of religion, perhaps clearer than I have since, but it was quite in my head. Well, now I fully believe the gospel and was persuaded that if I died at any time, I should perish everlastingly. And yet, such is man, I went on cheerful and gay. In 1785, he writes a letter to his friend William Pitt. On December the 2nd, he writes a letter to James Newton. Now, Newton is now 60 years old. Then on December the 2nd, he receives a letter from William Pitt. And on the 3rd, Wilberforce and Pitt talk for 2 hours. What is all this about? Wilberforce felt that he could not serve Parliament and be a Christian. But when he delivers his letter to John Newton on December the 4th, Newton contacts him and wants him to meet with him. And that meeting occurs 3 days later. And wanting to leave Parliament, Newton talks Wilberforce into staying so that God may use him there. So now he returns to the House of Commons in 1786, a different man with two great objects, as he called them. There were some immediate noticeable changes having to do with money and the use of time. He sells a house that he had inherited. It was much too big, too many rooms, too much upkeep, too much money being wasted. And then he used his time to change the plight of the poor. He said until that time he had never understood what it really meant to give your time, your talent, and your treasure. The second great object was this. Upon coming to faith, Wilberforce was deeply moved by the social decay all around him, and he knew that he wanted to do something about it. Robust Christianity was gone in England. Oh, the terms and the symbols would remain, but real religion was rejected. The English nobility immersed itself in excesses and decadence while ignoring the common folk around them. Alcoholism was epidemic and terribly fashionable. Public hangings were common, with the dead bodies being burnt for entertainment. Animal abuse was common as entertainment. And no less than 25% of single women were prostitutes. The average age, 16, with special houses offering 14-year-olds. In Parliament, Wilberforce championed two bills, putting an end to burning women at the stake, and the other one selling the corpses of hanged criminals for dissection. They both failed the House of Lords. He made a rookie mistake. He put both bills together, and the House of Lords felt that that was too much change in one bill. From then on, Wilberforce knew to split some of his bills and to not embellish with pork. Prior to this effort, previous monarchs had tried through proclamations to curb such behaviors, but there was no monitoring, no teeth to such efforts. It's kind of like when I met with the manager of the gymnasium that I used to attend, and she said, I would love for people to wear masks so I would not have to say anything, because if I say something, I might get insulted. So there were no teeth, no way of really putting forth the efforts in making these changes in the social life of England. In 1692, when William and Mary ascended to the throne, they published a book addressing societal manners. And they formed what was called a proclamation society, whereby all citizens were deputized to monitor what the royal proclamation called for. So Wilberforce wanted to resurrect that idea. So he goes to the bishop, a new bishop of London, Bishop Bilby Porteous, and goes to William Pitt, who took his idea to the Archbishop of Canterbury and to Queen Charlotte. Wilberforce's idea of a new proclamation society became a reality. Through this effort, Wilberforce brought civility and self-respect into a society that had long spiraled down into vice and misery. Now let's visit the first great object, abolishing the slave trade. There were some precursors to what I'll be covering in a minute. First was the Somerset Case. in 1792. Somerset was the last name of a slave who became free, worked, and bought his freedom, and then he returned to find that his master still wanted him back and put him in jail until he, the master, would return to put him back into slavery. The case went to court, and Somerset was set free, but only him, not any other slave. The other precursor was the ship Zong. The ship's surgeon, Alexander Falconbridge, talks about what occurred as slave ships moved about the Middle Passage, and that is Africa to the West Indies. The ships would go from England to Africa, unload the load that they carried. They would load the ship with slaves, and then they would go to the West Indies, where they would deliver the slaves, and then they would pick up other cargo and make it back to England. So this is what Falconbridge writes. The men Negroes, on being brought aboard the ship, are immediately fastened together, 2 by 2, by handcuffs on their wrists and by irons riveted on their legs. They are frequently stowed so close as to admit no other position than lying on their sides, nor will the height between decks, unless directly under the grating, permit the indulgence of an erect posture. And he goes on to describe other things that I didn't feel that it would be necessary for us to cover today. Slavery is ugly. Slavery is inhuman. Now, there was something that would go on also. Remember, this is a business. And under the business, there was a death covered by insurance if it was under the banner of peril of the sea. And what it meant that if there was a situation that occurred while the ship was at sea, and any one of the cargo of slaves died, because of that, the insurance would pay for that cargo that was lost. So Falconbridge says that 54 of the sickest men were thrown overboard, and that increased the profit of the ship by 1,620 pounds. The next day, 42 were thrown overboard, and the next day, 36 were thrown overboard, each time increasing the ship's profit. Now, underwriters decide to contest the claims in court, but the chief mate, full of remorse and guilt, testified on behalf of the underwriters. But still, the court found for Zong and its captain. Upon appeal, the judge equated the cargo loss this way: it is as if horses had been thrown into the sea. Case closed. There's another precursor. There's a Latin essay contest in Cambridge, Oxford, in 1785, and the new headmaster asks the following question: is it lawful to enslave others against their will? And a young man by the name of Thomas Clarkson wins and becomes an abolitionist. Another movement that occurred, will Quaker abolitionists form a 6-member committee in support of abolition. And then there was another figure that comes into the picture, and that is Lady Middleton. Lady Middleton's prominence role in promoting the cause of abolition is undeniable. Ramsay and Sir Charles Middleton had begun to see that some sort of parliamentary action would be needed to accomplish anything, but it was Lady Middleton who pushed things forward at a breakfast that autumn. Speaking to her husband in front of some others, she said, "Indeed, I think, Sir Charles, you ought to bring the subject before the House and demand a parliamentary inquiry into the nature of that hideous traffic, so disgraceful to the British character." Pressure is put on Wilberforce to lead the argument in Parliament. He resists, but soon after that, he agrees to spearhead the effort. So let's look at the first effort. Thomas Clarkson sets out to gather evidence. In that process, he interviews 20,000 sailors. And he finds that the English sailors, although being told that the experience in the slave trade would prepare them for the English Navy, the sailors were miserable. They wanted to escape. And also the mortality of these sailors was 25% a year. So what strategy did they take? They took to Parliament, coming out to abolish the slave trade, not slavery. This would be the right thing to do morally and economically. Cutting off the supply of slaves, the West Indies owners would treat their slaves better because there was no way of refilling the numbers. And also they would work towards international agreements with other countries, especially France. On December 1787, Wilberforce gives notice that he would be bringing forth a motion to abolish the slave trade to Parliament in 1788. Petitions with thousands of signatures come to Parliament. Unfortunately, on February 19th, Wilberforce becomes ill and nearly dies. After he recuperates, the diagnosis is ulcerative colitis, and he was not able to work for months, losing, if you will, that period of time, that session in Parliament where he could have presented all the information that Clarkson had found. At Parliament, argument continued by both sides with no resolution and no vote. So in April 1789, the Privy Council releases their report on slavery to Parliament. The report was 850 pages long. The West Indies, the owners and the traders, the regulation of the trade was the answer. If you regulate the trade, everything will be fine, they said. However, artists and poets depict the horrors of slavery. On May 12, 1789, Wilberforce would address Parliament, and he did that for 3.5 hours, beginning at 5 in the afternoon. He countered each false statement submitted by pro-slavery groups. It's been said that it was his best speech ever, but the effort failed. The court said that they needed to hear more evidence, as if more evidence would change anything, and Parliament adjourns for the summer. Now comes round two. It is now January 1790. And the committee hearings are pro and con. And on April 18th, 1791, over a year later, Wilberforce speaks for 4 hours in Parliament, ending late at night. Let me read to you a portion of what was said. Whatever may be its success, I attach my happiness to their cause and shall never relinquish it, he declared. Supported as I have been indeed, such a desertion would be most despicable. I have already gained for the wretched Africans the recognition of their claim to the rank of human beings, and I doubt not but the Parliament of Great Britain will no longer withhold them the rights of human nature. The noes were 163 and the ayes were 88. The abolition of the slave trade again is defeated. Then in 1792, an interesting change occurs. The popular attitude towards abolition wanes some, then resurges via music and poetry and petitions for abolition, numbering 517 petitions with thousands of names attached to them. Now, for the first time, humble citizens petition their representatives in Parliament. In the 1792 Parliament session, there's a notice by Wilberforce that he will be bringing abolition up for discussion again. Now, the French Revolution had influenced the minds of the members of Parliament. Liberty no longer sounded innocent and beautiful, and Wilberforce rises and moves for abolition. Another member of Parliament, Henry Dundas, brings up the idea of a gradual move towards abolition. It's like saying, yes, abolition is good, but not all at once. We need to gradually bring it to fruition. Very much like a via media in this case. It's bad, it's not good, but it's not good to end it rapidly. Gradually meant January of 1796, 4 more years of inhumanity and death. Now, between the years of 1792 and 1796, several things happened. In the spring of 1793, the Foreign Slave Bill is introduced. You cannot sell slaves to other countries. So if a ship goes to Africa and picks up a load of African slaves, they could not sell it to any other country. So if all of a sudden there was an overflow, if you will, of those who were being put under the yoke of the plantation owners, it was an issue of supply and demand. The price for those being sold would lower because there would be so many of them. So, after the third reading, this bill lost by 2 votes. Now it's February 1794, and again the Foreign Slave Bill is submitted. More arguing back and forth, and then it passes the House of Commons, but it fails in the House of Lords. Now it's November 1794 to 1795. In that year, Wilberforce comes out against the war with France in January of 1795. He and William Pitt, still being the prime minister, part ways. Their friendship kind of ends, comes to a sudden parting of the ways. And the king turns against abolition, does not want to hear anything that Wilberforce has to offer. But a mutual friend, by March of 1795, brings Pitt and Wilberforce together, and they reconcile. Now we're February 18th, 1796. At the end of that year, abolition would be a reality. So, as to not forget, Wilberforce again puts his motion for abolition. And there's a move to suspend the question. It failed. The second reading was on March 3rd, and it passed 63 to 31. Now, a very interesting thing occurs. The third reading is scheduled, but at the same night, there is an Italian play called Two Hunchbacks. that is played at the same time that Parliament is meeting. And apparently some of the pro-abolitionists decided to go to the play instead of going to Parliament. And the third reading fails 74-70 by 4 votes. Soon victory would come, though. Now it's been 20 years that Wilberforce has put forth his bill to be defeated. He is now 47, having entered Parliament at 21. On January the 2nd, 1807, William Grenville is the new Prime Minister. And he's the one that introduces and reads a bill called for the abolition of the slave trade. He speaks of all the effort and all the work that Wilberforce had done. He praises him. And although always calm, cool, and collected, Wilberforce weeps and is not able to stand and speak. But it wasn't needed, because the next month, on February the 4th, at the second reading and debate, the bill passes 100-36. And 21 days later, the bill again is taken up for the third reading and it passes 283-16. Wilberforce fought for this for many years. And again, he is not known that well, although found to be the spearhead of abolition of the slave trade. Years after that, not many years after that, there was the abolition of slavery and eventually emancipation for those in England, in France, and other places throughout the world. We came in later than that. Nevertheless, we did abolish slavery. And I want to read to you, to end this presentation, what Sam Portaro says about this whole situation of abolition. The system is vast. Its reformation will demand everything of all of us. And we need friends and mentors with the insight to direct our gifts and clarify our discernment, that we might be servants like William Wilberforce, wholly and skillfully dedicated to God's service. William Wilberforce is buried in Westminster Abbey after his death in July 29, 1833. William Wilberforce, a hero of abolition. Thank you all. Have a great day.